Where did there we go. Well, we got it. Now I'm going to be tasked with finding it, as you said, so that it can be shared. But that's good. I'm glad I remembered. All righty. Let me just jump in then. Any former Catholics? No former Catholics. Okay. I'm talking about somebody who is reputed to be as blessed a saint as the Catholic Church probably ever spawned.
Huh.
However, those who know better or claim to know better say that that's not fair assessment at all. Thomas Merton, who we'll be looking at next week, was a devotee of this one. This is Saint Therese of Lisieux, whose dates are 1873 to 1897. 1873, 1897. Anybody do the math?
23. 4.
Yeah, 24, right. Very young to sainthood. She's known to the Catholic Church as the Little Flower. I'm not sure she'd be happy with that. She would say, if I'm a little flower, it's not a rose, it's not a lily, it'd be a common daisy. And there's reason for that, and we will tease that out. She's also considered the author of The Way of Spiritual Childhood. And yet, once again, that is not her, it's not a title she gave herself. It's something her older sister gave her. She had several sisters. We'll talk about them. The oldest one, the first to a convent, considered herself in charge of her sister's legacy, and came up with that title. She did speak of something called My Little Way, and that's why we're looking at her amongst these others. Now, what other way was there to follow? We're talking about following Jesus. We're talking about trying to get to heaven. We're talking about having a spiritual life of some depth. Let me say that she comes hard on or hard into a time of Jansenism, considered a Catholic heresy, and also in France, highly influenced by Joan of Arc, who was Teresa's favorite saint growing up. Jansenism is a way of believing that is so exacting that if you want to be holy, you had to not only, do your duty, but perform a host of good works to earn enough spiritual merit so that you could avoid purgatory. This saint fits with Julian of Norwich in that she didn't have one good word to say about purgatory. It's not that she didn't believe in it, but her attitude toward it made her who she was to a degree, and we'll get into that as well. Julian of Norwich, as if you were with us at that time, never said there was no purgatory. All she said, remember, was that in her visions, Jesus never showed her anything having to do with purgatory or hell. And 9 out of 10 or 99 out of 100 people who claim to have visions in the medieval times when Julian lived claim to have seen the horrors of purgatory. These are two women who were concerned with the love of God as opposed to the wrath of God, which of course is why we're taking the time to learn about her. And again, Therese comes at a time when the wrath of God was a huge thing. And it lasted up until Vatican II. Anybody want to give me a date for Vatican II? Those of you who pay attention to such things. I'm quizzing you a little. We're thinking about 1960, 61, 62 is probably a better date. Coming from Pope John the 23rd, who was the Pope who was elected as a space holder because people didn't think that Pope Pius's first secretary, who was who eventually became Paul VI, was ready to be Pope yet. So they figured, John wouldn't live very long. He probably wouldn't do anything. He had some notoriety because of World War II and doing some lovely things having to do with protecting Jews. And he blew them all out of the water by saying, I have come to open the windows of a church that's been shut up for far too long. Let the breeze blow. Paul VI, however, comes after John the 23rd and speaks highly of Therese and says that she recovered the heart of the gospel. That's a quote. And the heart of the gospel being the love of God. Back to Julian for a minute. Julian of Norwich was not a saint of the Catholic Church. She was sainted by the Anglican Church in England. She's from Norwich, England. There you go. But the reason the Catholic Church didn't saint her was that she was a bit too disturbing because they felt that she expressed something too close to doubt about the existence of purgatory and hell. That's my opinion. It may not be the ultimate opinion of the church. They certainly probably wouldn't say it. Therese was put forward. Remember, her dates again are 1873 to 1897. She was put forward for sainthood by Pope Benedict the 15th in, hi, Julie, come on in. Therese was put forward by Pope Benedict the 15th in 1921. And Benedict said that she was like an iceberg in that she looked small on top, but deep down she was tremendous spiritually. And I like that. I know nothing else about Pope Benedict the 15th from the 1920s. But so I'm trying to give you some of the legacy, the reputation of this saint early on, so that you don't dismiss her out of hand when you hear some of the things that she was about as a child. She was in fact declared a doctor of the church by John Paul II in 1997. So she's got incredible credentials. There are only four other women, or four women, I mean, who have been so designated. And a doctor of the church is based on a saint's, I think they're all saints, writings. And the incredible thing about Therese is she has just one little book called The Story of a Soul, which is her spiritual autobiography. Um, and that story is about trying to communicate a way to God for common people, which is why she fits so well with Vatican II. What happened in Vatican II when, as I said earlier, Pope John the 23rd said he wanted to open the windows of a church too long, closed up and stale. Um, what we're talking about is the democratization of sainthood. In fact, greater than that, the democratization of the Catholic Church. Um, and this is very familiar to Protestants. In fact, what we've been talking about when we've been looking at all these saints, um, all these mystics, I should say, is that, and I'm looking at it through Presbyterian eyes here, but they all have, you know, some marks of Protestantism, uh, skepticism about purgatory for progressives, skepticism about hell itself, uh, a sense of God's love being more important than anything else, God's grace being a vigorous thing, not a weak thing, and a sense that sainthood is for everyone. That's exactly what Saint Therese of Lisieux, our saint tonight, was talking about. And we have in our hymn book a famous hymn called For All the Saints. And those saints are all the choir invisible, as we might call them, right? Um, those who have passed. So let me jump in now after that kind of grandiose introduction and give you this woman's biography as I understand it. Uh, Her father, Louis Martin, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, was born into a strict military family in France, wanted a military career, but didn't make it, then decided he wanted to be a priest, but he couldn't manage the Latin. So he became instead a successful watchmaker and settled down for a quiet life in a small French town, um, and made a success of being a watchmaker. Teresa's mother, Zélie, was also from a military family, which is why, of course, they were probably allowed to marry. Zélie's family was known to be very cold, very formal. She herself wanted a religious life, but for one reason or another was dissuaded by the church. And I have no idea what that was about. But in her marriage to Martin, she bore 9 children in 15 years, 7 girls and 2 boys, the last of which was Therese, who bears all the marks of the spoiled, smallest child who was never told to do any chores and who was probably carried by her sisters from one place to another and didn't even have to walk. At least that's something I get from what I've read about her. However, I mentioned 9 children, 7 girls, 2 boys. In a period of 3 years, the 2 boys and 2 of the girls died. So 3 years, 4 deaths of these children out of 9. Uh, People told Zélie, the mother, that it would have been better had they not been born. The suffering was too great. But she blanched at that, believed that they went on to heaven ahead of them. She held to that. She had to find something. People in those days, you lose half your children. How do you live? That's just hard to imagine. And that last child, Therese, was born, as I said, in 1873, very weak, very frail. Um, at 3 months of age, her mother wrote, quote, "I have no hope of saving her. She suffers terribly." And she had an intestinal problem of some sort, which could easily have been, milk allergy, wheat allergy, Crohn's, colitis, I don't know. I don't know. Who knows? But it was something that she carried with her whole life. Um, Other thing notable besides those deaths that came early was that all five surviving girls entered the convent, or a convent. There were two different convents they chose. Um, as a child, she and her sisters had a favorite game, which was playing Desert Hermits, which of course you all did too, right? I didn't even know about Desert Hermits till I was nearly 40, I think. But she knew about them. She knew all about the tradition of the Desert Fathers. Probably, I hope they would have an understanding of some Desert Mothers if they chose among the girls to play that game. They would make little huts. They would eat vegetables or pretend to eat vegetables, and they would make ostentatious signs of the cross over just everything. So these are Catholic children to an nth degree. Um, at her first communion at the age of 11, she felt that it had come to her as a lover's kiss from Jesus. Um, I understand a lot of Catholics have first communion around the age of 8. Hers came later. Um, and this business of it being a lover's kiss from Jesus obviously offers some, I don't want to use the word erotic, but it has some romantic weight to it. Um, she felt, as she said, that she had disappeared like a drop into the ocean, which I don't find that to be particularly healthy to lose yourself like that into another being, even if it's God. But anyway, she was probably rewarded for it, or at least esteemed for it. She did one thing of interest at that time at the age of 11. She made, among others, a resolution to never give in to the temptation to discouragement, um, which I find interesting. She was considered to be extremely strong-willed. So she had in her whatever was needed not to give up. And in fact, her mother died when she was 4 years old. Uh, so she knew about loss early on in an extreme way. And when we're talking about discouragement, the first thing I ever learned about Therese, I think, before I learned her story, was that line, that quote I've used once in the sermon, that she says, if you can serenely bear the trial of being displeasing to yourself, you will be for Jesus a pleasant place of shelter. Now, when I've shared that quote, some people write it down immediately, put it on their refrigerator. Some people just throw up their hands and say, what in the world? Let me say it again. If you can serenely bear the trial of being displeasing to yourself, you will be for Jesus a pleasant place of shelter. I think the way to unpack that is to go forward and turn it upside down and say, if you can't bear the trial of being displeasing to yourself, Jesus cannot take shelter in you at all. The Jesus of grace, of love, needs us to be self-forgiving to some degree. And that makes plenty of sense to me. Like so many people affected by what I call Jansenism, the idea that harder is better, that God wants us to suffer. Therese had early on an attraction to suffering. Again, she'd lost brothers, sisters, a mother, and then her oldest sister joined the convent when she was 9. Um, So, and the older sister was her second mother. Um, One piece of literature that was well known at the time was Thomas à Kempis's book, The Imitation of Christ. Has anyone read that? I had to read it as part of a class in college, and it's interesting. Uh, in that book, Imitation of Christ, um, Kempis says, Jesus, he prays this prayer, Jesus, sweet to the taste beyond all our telling, turn all earthly consolations into bitterness for me. Um, there's Jansenism altogether. Jesus, sweet to the taste beyond all our telling, turn all our earthly consolations into bitterness. Okay. Um, Now, again, this is a time when people were concerned to a great degree with purgatory, and Catholics would rate themselves in terms of spirituality based on the number of merits that they felt they'd stored up that might help them have as brief a time in purgatory as possible. To think you could pass on purgatory would be kind of to assume a lot. When she was very small, her sister Marie brought home from boarding school a string of sacrifice beads. And she was to use those beads to count the day's merits, whatever she did, helping somebody across the street, feeding a bird. I don't know what the merits amounted to. She gave them to her sisters as well, and Therese demanded one. Um, she was very sensitive. She was always worrying about whether she could ever accumulate enough merit herself. Um, but then at some point, very early, she decided that that was too hard a task, not just for her, but for anyone. And she felt that God, through the scriptures, and I don't know the scripture she had in mind, pointed out to her in her meditations a quick way to holiness. Uh, an easy way to go, as she said, straight to heaven. That is to abandon yourself totally to God as a child entrusts him or herself to his parent. And her little way was born in that. Again, not trying to find your own way through merits, but instead, or to depend on people to pray you to purgatory, out of purgatory, which of course had been going on since the Middle Ages. But instead to just trust God completely, that God would do the work. Um, and maybe she's like Martin Luther and others who looked into the New Testament and saw that there amongst Paul's words about grace. Anyway, she stopped storing up merits, stopped counting merits. Um, and one day toward the end of her life, her sister, um, lamenting that she had really no works to offer God on Judgment Day. That's how she said it. Therese, considering herself pretty much the same, said she wasn't at all perturbed by that. That since she could give God nothing, God would supply everything. That's how it was put. Since she could give God nothing, God would supply everything. Um, I think that's where Pope Paul VI considered her, Benedict the 15th considered her an iceberg. She's talking about a small way, is known for her small way, and yet it has a profundity that you wonder where she got this. Her mother claimed that she was alarmingly precocious. Her mother said of her, she remembers absolutely everything. You all know that person. Maybe you were that person growing up. Um, I think my oldest granddaughter is that way. She never forgets anything I read her, that's for sure. Therese was also known for an incredible temper. Um, just she could throw huge tantrums and obviously got away with it. I said her mother died when she was 4. She had breast cancer. The father moved the family away from that town where they lived. I don't know why. I can't even remember the name of it, but they moved to Lisieux, where um, he transferred his business as a watchmaker or went to work for someone else. I don't know enough. 2 years later, as I said, the oldest daughter, Pauline, who was a second mother to Therese, joined the convent there, which Therese said was the saddest moment of her life. She lost so many things, and that was huge. Um, um, and Therese said shortly after that she too, at age of 9, wanted to join the Carmelites. That was the convent. And the bishop of the town or the area said she was way too young. But Therese said, I came to the conclusion that the convent must be the desert that God means me to take refuge in. So again, she's thinking about the desert tradition. She was very sick for a number of years, was bedridden, again, with some intestinal thing. uh, and said that the thing that kept her alive was her desire to be a nun herself. She also had migraines. Then Sister Marie, her third mother, entered the Carmelite convent, and Therese just felt like abandonment was her life. And kind of out of that, a sense of repeated loss, she came up with a mission for herself. Uh, that is that after death, she didn't expect a long life. After her death, she said she wished to do good deeds to people on earth uh, afterward. That somehow God would enable her to uh, breach the bounds of heaven, uh, between heaven and earth, and do good deeds for people. The way Catholics, I think, count on saints to do that. Um, and I find this interesting in that there is in Buddhism, this sense of being a bodhisattva. It's in Mahayana Buddhism. And a bodhisattva is a person who's able to reach nirvana, who has been enlightened, but delays doing so out of compassion in order to minister and help other suffering human beings find their way um, to uh, to nirvana themselves. It's very different, of course, but there is, I think, the same spirit there. Um, Christmas of 1886, when she's 13, she comes home for midnight mass, Christmas Eve, and she feels that she has all at once gotten spiritual release. That is, that she's beginning a new chapter in which she feels freed from her ego. Uh, and really, I think that's when this whole business of this mission she hoped to have after death came really clear to her. Another sister entered a different convent about that time. Then at age 15, Therese tried one more time to enter the convent her sister Pauline had gone to, the Carmelites. Um, and at that point, when the bishop said no, she decided she would go to the Pope himself and appeal. So she went to Rome with her father, And Pope Leo the 13th was celebrating his golden jubilee at the time. 50 years, I guess, as Pope. So she goes right up to the Pope and asks her favor. She says, in honor of your jubilee, please permit me to enter the convent. And Pope Leo hears something from someone about this little girl from France and says, well, my child, do what your superiors tell you. Um, and not wanting to take that for an answer, she was prepared with that no, and said, Holy Father, if you say yes, everyone will agree and let me go. And he consulted a little more with someone else who knew her and said, go, you will enter the convent if God wills it. And finally, a few months later, she was allowed. And so she spent her last 9 years at the Carmelite convent behind bars, pretty much, where you're cut off from the rest of the world. Um, and this is one of my favorite details from her life. Um, she's in the convent, she's been there a little bit. She's having a bit of a hard time adjusting, as anyone would. I don't know what part of it was disagreeable to her, but the oldest nun in the convent comes up to her to comfort her and says, wait for it. She says to Therese, the first 30 years are the hardest. Oh, I just love that. Uh, Especially, of course, when you think of this woman who would live 9 years and die. Uh, but I just can't imagine a world where one could say that to oneself and get along just fine, thinking, well, it's only the first 30 years that are difficult. Uh, Therese had a very normal kind of time in the convent. Um, she was very playful. She wrote skits and poems, skits for the nuns. She cleaned the dining room. She helped in the kitchen and the laundry. She did everything there was to do. There was absolutely nothing that was remarkable about her, but she was developing her own little inner way. As I said, that is a way that she considered very straight to God. She said, how could God expect me to, climb up to the dome of St. Peter's on those stone steps on my knees? Um, Catholics are always climbing up steps on their knees, gaining merit. This happens today as it's happened since the Middle Ages. Um, she said, no, God uh, would clearly provide someone like me and others as well an elevator to get there. And she knew all about elevators. They had them at the end of the 19th century. Um, she was dealing with her impulses. No better place than being in a convent, probably, to figure that out. And when she first went in, she still had some of the Jansenism in her that I said was so prevalent in the late 1900 or 1800s. Here's how she said it. This is her prayer to Jesus at that time. She said, a single form of martyrdom would not be enough for me. I should want to experience them all. I should want to be scourged and crucified as you were, to be flayed alive like Saint Bartholomew, to be dipped in boiling oil like Saint John, offering my neck to the executioner like Saint Agnes or Saint Cecily. Cecil, Cecil, I don't know to say that name. And like my favorite Joan of Arc, whispering your name as I was tied to the stake to be burned. Um, um, but, and this is the important thing, early on in the convent, she was reading St. Paul as she was instructed to do, and she discovers 1 Corinthians 13. And this is when she comes to decide that love, not heroics, is the purpose of life, of the spiritual life. Now, that's something we talked about the very first evening. We talked about the Desert Fathers. They had that struggle. Many of them were tempted by spiritual heroics, flaying their flesh, going without food for days, if not weeks on end. And there is in the literature of the desert, the strong words from the wise elders, abbots, that said that's a spiritual dead end. And she realized this herself by reading St. Paul, and perhaps she was instructed in this as well. But there's the line in 1 Corinthians 13 that's almost hidden there, but it's significant for her, where it says, if I give away all I have, and if I deliver my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. So I think that's where she felt that this business of love above self-abnegation and suffering uh, found its foundation. In fact, she said it made sense to her because, and here's a quote from her spiritual biography, autobiography, love is all the skill I have. Um, Again, that's another moment when I find the here is that person who has a profound spirit and a profound sense of proportion when it comes to spiritual matters. Um, Looking back on that childhood quote, wanting all the martyrdoms that you could get, at the very end of her life, when she was a month or two away from dying of tuberculosis, again at the age of 24, she said to someone when death was becoming pretty clear to her, is it possible that I who long for martyrdom will die in bed? So that I think gives us a sense of what she was about. She no longer dreamed of dreadful martyrdoms. In fact, she said she realized that her life was already a burnt offering for a purpose that she could only dimly understand, but felt that she'd been chosen for. She became, at the end, somewhere in the end, in the last years, assistant to the novice master. Again, she's in charge of the new nuns who came in. And she felt at once, when she was given that assistantship, uh, the spur to have to grow up. She'd always, she's the youngest child, so there's always that theme in her life that she's the baby. Uh, but she felt that she had to jettison some of her childhood impulses. Uh, and it struck her that and this is how she understands herself, it struck her that her very poverty of gifts and skills um, and opportunities in life might make her a representative of all who were poor and inadequate in the world, but who would strive to love God all the same. So let me say that again. It's her sense of herself as very small, not gifted, particularly in any way, um, put behind bars in a convent, um, the perfect representative of all who are poor and inadequate, who feel the same way about themselves, but who still strive to love God as best they can. And in fact, she dies of the most common fatal illness that we can imagine in the 19th century, tuberculosis. Um, this is kind of interesting too. I'd said before that there was nothing remarkable about her. again, this is something that was perceived by her sisters and all those who were in the convent as well. Um, they would pray 6.5 hours a day. I mean, that was their job, to pray for uh, their community and for all who came in touch with them. 6.5 hours a day. And she fell asleep during common prayer every day. Um, and the way she made sense of this was to say, just as parents love their children as much when they're asleep as awake, so God seems to love me even when I sleep during prayer time. Um, I mean, that could be an excuse, but in some sense, I think the little theologian inside her sized that up for herself. Um, Again, it's someone who's realized that being simple um, is not necessarily a bad thing. She understood who she was in a very significant way and in a very healthy way, I think, as well, and taught simplicity and said out loud she did not trust long prayers. Or wrote prayers. She didn't like anything written down or memorized. Um, And so she got along in the convent as best she could, doing her work with people who were more than, I mean, who were just normal people who would explode out of anger, who had trouble with the communal life, as anyone would. Um, I remember Alec Guinness visited a monastery in England and was his first time at a particular monastery. He liked to do that. And a monk stopped him on the way to his room and said, "What do you think the hardest part of being a monk would be?" And Guinness said, "Other monks?" And he said, "Yeah, that was it." Um, they have to get along. It's not easy in any place like that. Um, there was one particular nun she knew who was a Sister Saint Pierre, who was, we'd call her a piece of work today. And, just was complaining constantly. And Therese saw it as um, her work on her own spirit to be the nicest, sweetest person she could to this woman. When before she entered the convent, she would never have give a person like that, uh, the time of day. Um, okay, so again, she's called the Little Flower. Uh, Probably as much by people who don't quite understand the profundity of her understanding of herself and her calling. But again, if she was told that, she would have said that she was a simple wildflower, not anything fancy. Um, she she said that she has bloomed where she was planted and had tried her best to use her short life to the fullest. Um, Again, she was canonized in 1925, not too many years after. There's a process of beatification that has steps, and she got there pretty quickly because of her book and because so many people thought, yes, there is a saint I can identify with, someone who doesn't claim any particular talent for sainthood. She was also, like the other mystics we've looked at, very comfortable with mystery. She said life is but a moment between two eternities. And could be she picked that up from somebody else. I don't know, but it's attributed to her now. She's a model for suffering, for facing suffering and death with grace. And shortly before she died, she said, "I feel my mission is about to begin to help people love God in, as she said, her simple way, and that she would spend eternity doing good deeds for people on earth. I don't know what to make of that. Spiritually, particularly, as a Protestant, I'm totally out of ideas. But there it is. As I said, all these remarkable people um, found her profound when they read her book and heard stories of her life from her sisters and others. Um, One thing that's very interesting to me is that while there was nothing remarkable about her that people could point to, the by the time she died of TB in the convent, the sisters all thought she was already a saint. They were even telling her that when she died, her body would not decompose. And she said, "Oh, that's ridiculous. I'll rot." So she didn't have any ideas that were inflated about that. Uh, and of course, we all know that there are stories all the time about these people who are found to have some sort of merit, whose bodies don't decompose for whatever reason that only forensic specialists could understand and explain to us. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, uh, I forgot her real name, grew up in Romania, but she wanted to take the name Therese after this particular little saint. But it was already taken by someone in her convent. And so she took Teresa instead, after Teresa of Avila. But the saint that she was devoted to was Teresa of Lisieux. Um, Let's see if there's anything else of note. Oh, Thomas Merton, who we'll talk about next week, was totally devoted to her as well. Someone else who was quite devoted to her is Richard Rohr. And of course, if Richard Rohr thinks she's something, she's got to be something. Okay. Let me see. I thought I'd share a little bit of what Rohr says about her. Um, but before I do, let me just throw this open to your any reflections you might have on this. If it reminds you of anything, or uh, you want to know something more about her, I may or may not know anything.
Mhm.
Yeah, Sue.
Too, yeah. What year did she die?
1897 at the age of 24.
Oh, yeah, you said 24. So when was she born then?
1873.
1873 to
Right, right,
1897.
right.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah. So she's kind of modern. Again, she can use an elevator as an image for going to God. However, we think of that as quite a long time ago. Let me add this one thing that I find interesting, and this is about her attitude toward purgatory. When she was a novice, when she was in charge of novices, she taught them that they could avoid purgatory. And this just was unheard of. Um, Besides, none of the novices was particularly holy. They were all average with natural weaknesses. Um, and very, very few of them had an accumulation of meritorious acts to balance the weight of their sins, according to people who wrote about them. Um, but she taught them that they could go straight to heaven when they died because all he had to do was trust God for everything. Um, Again, that's a Protestant idea. I doubt she got it from any Protestant. Um, However, that's part of her understanding, and it fits with a lot of people that we've certainly been influenced by in the Protestant church. Anything else?
I was thinking about, you mentioned the Bodhisattva aspect, and when you talked about Jansenism, I thought, boy, that sounds Buddhist. And then, and went to the Bodhisattva. So, yeah. And you said Jansenism was popular in that period?
Right. And popular too into the 20th century, right up until Pope John the 23rd and his decision to try to have a reform that did its best to throw out the sense of harshness, the harsh image of God. I'm not a theologian. I'm certainly not a student of Catholic history, particularly, but this is going on today too. We've got Pope Francis, who's quite liberal and very in tune with Vatican II, whereas his predecessor Benedict was wanting to go back to pre-Vatican II Catholicism with not just the Latin Mass, but with the idea of a God who loomed quite large as a judge. However, I think those who put him forward for sainthood now, I'm talking about Benedict, may not understand him. His writings are actually full of grace, and he, in fact, kind of liked Francis a lot, from what I could tell. So, there's people and there are parties in any religion, I guess, and they're at odds all the time.
The other thing that hit me very strongly as somebody who lived in the Detroit area, where you said the Little Flower, and I went, the Shrine of the Little Flower,
There you are.
Father Coughlin's church. And so I just looked it up, and I said that was founded in 1925, the same year that she was
Right.
sanctified or whatever.
And wasn't he kind of
Yeah, the
a
first and longest pastor there was a fascist. He was a Nazi.
right?
And he was a radio Nazi who was reaching out to the whole country.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. I doubt that she would have liked that. 1925. Interesting. Well, that's when the Italian, when Mussolini was gaining power. He was before Hitler when it
Yeah,
came
so
to.
I wonder what was in the zeitgeist at that point that that brought those two things together.
Absolutely no idea. That would be worth trying to figure out, though.
Scott,
Jump in.
it was part of this sense that you had to perform all of these things. Does that trace back to the idea of original sin, that we're evil when
Yeah.
we are born, and we have
It goes right back to St. Augustine. Yeah. We're born in sin. Sex is awful. All of that. Okay.
Maybe just, I did post in the chat, the archive.com resources if anybody wants to read any of her stuff. She did some poems and as well as her autobiography.
Yeah. Yeah. Just
How do you reach that, Doug?
Just copy the sites
In
and then just click on them and it'll take you to the archive.com, or you can go to archive.com and put in her name and they'll pull up all the books that are related to her life.
I could email you the link, Sue.
So what was the church?
As simple as you can do it, that would be nice. I'm not a tech.
Okay, I'll do that. Yeah. Somebody else was speaking. Who was it?
What was the Catholic Church's reason for finding her particularly as a saint at that time? Like, what did they find in her? I'm trying to go back to this. What does this all mean in the early 20th century? But
Right.
Mhm.
I think her young death had a lot to do with it.
Hmm.
You know, they're always looking for saints among those who live the shortest lives.
Hmm.
Um, there's some connection for them to that. Maybe that goes all the way back to people who were martyred in the Roman times. I'm not sure. But there is an originality to her. I mean, she claimed that, you know, Jesus showed her this way. She didn't say that she came up with it like a scholar. Um, so I think there is that fact that people took her at her word about that.
God, could I say something about early sainthood?
Sure.
A person becoming a saint has some really strict rules. You need to have a minimum number of authenticated miracles that are attributed to that particular saint. And if a person has lived such an exemplary life and has been such a selfless person, it's like this groundswell that builds that the Vatican doesn't ignore. So if there's a popular um, attraction, I'm sorry, that's my dog. If there's a popular idea that this person should be a saint, then that will happen. And so, like Mother Teresa and John Paul II were right like that, they were made saints. Whereas someone like Thea Bowman, who is this wonderful servant of God, she's a servant of God, which is um, uh, one of the steps to becoming a saint. She's taken a lot longer, and part of that is because she was the gadfly to the archbishops.
Yeah.
But Teresa didn't do that.
Right. And again, there's something very easy and attractive about her excellent articulation of what she understood as her way. She said that in contrast to the big way of heroic perfectionism, which, you know, some saints claimed and were sainted for, she says, um, that she said, I'm just a little one. And because of my smallness, I draw God's love toward me. God has to love me and help me because I can't do anything by myself. So I bring to God every day, not my perfection, but my imperfection. Um, and she said, quote, I know God comes rushing toward me as a result. Um, she who can't identify with that?
Mhm.
If that's what you want, if you know that she makes more sense than any saint that came before her, for that very reason.
Mhm.
Clearly the youngest in the family.
Right, there is that to it as well, isn't it? Everybody was always coming rushing toward her,
That's right.
right? To pick her up in case she walked in front of a horse and carriage, probably.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Oh, let me show you a picture. I can give you a picture of this saint. She's quite winsome and adorable.
Hmm. Interesting.
And smart as hell, obviously, too. She said she had no gifts, but she obviously had a gift for articulating profound things in simple terms, straightforward terms. That was absolutely necessary for her to be who she was. All
I'm
right.
curious.
Now go ahead.
Um, So being in the convent all these years, what miracles did she perform, or was she
Right.
associated?
Right. Well, those, as Eileen was saying, the miracles that one would attribute to her would be people praying for healings, most likely, and receiving them after praying directly to her repeatedly and saying, well, I had incurable cancer, but I prayed to Saint Therese over a period of 6 months, and look, I'm cancer free. And that's the kind of thing that someone, a priest who's in charge of that kind of investigation would interrogate the person about and attribute to Therese if it was deemed genuine. That's the kind of thing. Yeah. And I mean, how can you, it's a funny business, right? I mean, how do you, it's hard to say what's genuine and what's not when it comes to the mysteries of healings. All right. Next week, Thomas Merton.
You're
Who
going to tell us what Richard said about her.
Oh, I was, wasn't I? Yeah. Well, that part of what
Please.
yeah, let me give you that. Therese came into the 19th century Catholic Church that was controlled by Jansenism, the belief in an angry, punitive God, perfectionism, and validation by personal good behavior, which is very unstable and illusory. In the midst of this rigid environment, Therese says, quote, I'm convinced that my message is really new. Jesus himself taught me this. This had been forgotten by most Christians, Richard says, by the 19th century, so much so that Therese had to call it new. Therese called this simple childlike path her little way. It is a spirituality of imperfection. She says, quote, Jesus deigned to show me the road that leads to this divine furnace of God's love, and this road is the surrender of the little child who sleeps without fear in its father's arms. In a letter to priest Adolphe Roulon, Therese writes, quote, perfection seems simple to me. I see it is sufficient to recognize one's nothingness and to abandon oneself as a child into God's arms, unquote. Any Christian perfection is, in fact, our ability to include, forgive, and accept our own imperfection. And Richard said in another place, I think imperfection is the organizing principle of the entire human historical and spiritual enterprise. Imperfection in the great spiritual traditions is not just to be tolerated, excused, and even forgiven. It is the very framework inside of which God makes the God self known and calls us into gracious union. It's what allows us and sometimes forces us to fall into the arms of the living God. Thank you for asking for that. That was very helpful.
Gotta love Richard.
Yeah, I'm willing to give him all kudos, from whom all blessings flow, right? Okay, I've kept you over, but this has been fun. I'm enthusiastic about this. I think I love it because it's so not what's the word, into counterintuitive. That's what it is. In every sense of the word. Kind of love things that break the mold. So again, next week, Thomas Merton, who's a real character, in every sense of the word, a brilliant marvel, in many ways. So I'll bring some personal things to that, as well. So blessings on all, as Therese as a child would have given you lots of crosses. Okay. Much love. Sleep well. And thanks again, Doug, for giving us some really nice background there. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.